Hi everyone. Today we're going to experiment with a literary device called imagery. Imagery is a broad term that encompasses a lot of things, which I'm going to break down for you. Overall, imagery simply includes the words, phrases, and language used to describe a scene, character, setting, interaction, conflict, things like that. It includes sensory details and can also include something called figurative language. Imagery should always be specific, and writers should be careful not to be either too descriptive or not descriptive enough. You want to give the reader enough information to accurately picture a moment as you describe it using your language. So let's review the different types of imagery there are. We'll start with sensory details, and all you need to do with this is remember your five senses: your sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches. You want to include language in your narrative writing that pays attention to these sensory details. For example, with sight, instead of saying that he looked tired, use specific language that helps the reader picture it in their imagination. Talk about the dark circles underneath his eyes and the dull gaze in his stare as he trudges through the kitchen in his thin, ripped bathrobe. Show the reader. Don't tell. For sounds, instead of saying the motorcycle was loud, use specific language that helps the reader hear it in their imagination. Talk about the blaring rev of the engine and the skrrr of the rubber on pavement and the smell of smoke that lingers after the bike has long sped off. Show the reader, don't tell. With smells, instead of saying something like, his burp stank, use specific language that helps the reader actually smell that belch. Talk about the putrid garlic odor or the smell of rotten meat left out on the counter for too long. Show, don't tell. Kind of the same thing with tastes and touches. I think you get the point. The key here is to use your imagination and use specific words that mean exactly what you are trying to communicate. Avoid lazy words like awesome and amazing and great. They don't really mean anything because we overuse them, and that's why they're called lazy words, because we're not taking the time to think about what we really mean. After sensory details, you have something called figurative language, and this is probably reviewed from middle school. When we use figurative language, we're not being literal, we're not being for real. Take a simile, for example. When we say his face turned as red as a tomato, we don't mean that his face is literally turning that red. It is a figure of speech, which is why it's called figurative language. And the only reason we use this expression is to show the reader instead of tell them what this kid's face looks like, to give them the joy of picturing it in their own imaginations. Metaphors are just like similes, both compare two things, but a simile uses the words like or as, and a metaphor does not. It's raining cats and dogs is a metaphor. No, it will never literally rain cats and dogs. The writer's just trying to communicate in a figurative and a creative way that the rain is coming down heavy. With alliteration, that's the repetition of the same hard consonant sound. And Cisneros does this a lot in her writing. One example of alliteration in her novella is when the narrator, Esperanza, meets her new neighbors, Rachel and Lucy. Esperanza describes them to us, commenting that they are wearing shiny Sunday shoes without socks. Shiny Sunday shoes without socks. There's quite a bit of alliteration of the S sound in this sentence, which draws the reader's attention to the passage and the girls being described. This one sentence that points out that they're simultaneously nicely dressed, but also a little messy, which adds to their character and helps point out that they're important. So today you're going to read a short story called All Summer in a Day. I think you'll be able to make a lot of comparisons to the story and what you're all going through today with this seemingly endless quarantine. The audio is going to be in a separate recording, so you can pause this and then come back once you have read it. The examples of imagery are pretty easy to point out from the get-go. So, right off the bat, we see a simile used to describe the children and how they're pressed to each other like so many roses, so many weeds intermixed. That's right in the beginning here. This creates a very specific image in the reader's mind of the young children crowded together and shows us that something exciting is about to happen. At first, when we see the sentence here, it had been raining for 7 years, we think that's possibly an exaggeration, but it's actually the truth. In this story, the rain has been coming down for 7 years. And Bradbury uses the metaphor of a concussion of storms right here, along with tidal waves, to describe just how intense this rain is. When we hear the word concussion, we might think of the traumatic brain injury. It's abrupt and it can result from hitting your head too hard. It's a stunning, shattering blow, and it can mess you up for life. Um, Now, imagine hearing that noise times a million for every raindrop, every second of every day for 7 years. That metaphor, if you really stop and think about it, which is what you're supposed to do when you're reading, helps us envision just how powerful and all consuming this rain actually is. Um, Bradbury also does a good job of using sensory details to help the reader imagine the characters and the setting. Let's go to Margot, where he first describes her. So here she is. He describes Margot as a very frail girl who looked as she'd been lost in the rain for years, and the rain had washed out the blue from her eyes and the red from her mouth and the yellow from her hair. She was an old photograph, dusted from an album, whitened away. And if she spoke at all, her voice would be a ghost. Can you picture Margot after reading that description? I imagine her as small and skinny and pale, with thin, mousy hair and uninteresting features. I imagine her voice as quiet and timid. So it's interesting that she's such an outcast and such a target when she really doesn't stand out that much. We see several examples of alliteration as well. Um, let's see. Let me find my one example about the rain. Yeah, here we go. Right at the top right column here. Um, Once the rain stops, the door slid back, and the smell of the silent, waiting world came in to the children. There are some repeating S and W sounds that really force us to slow down and pronounce the entire word. It makes us slow down, like I said, and take in the scene, which is exactly what the children are about to do now that the rain has stopped. Tons of other examples in the story. That's really all this story is, and I think it's so effective because Bradbury uses specific language to help you really put yourself in this moment. So it's your turn now. I want you to go to your vignettes Google Doc and find your vignette titled Growing Up. Today, I would like you to revise this vignette using imagery. How can you use similes, metaphors, alliteration, and sensory details to communicate a theme related to growing up? First, I'd like to advise you to use the same strategy that you did yesterday when you were doing juxtaposition. If you can think of a metaphor to use for growing up, then think of how you can use similar language throughout your entire vignette. So if you're comparing the process of growing up to a flower blooming and then withering, then you might want to use verbs and nouns and adjectives that are related to flowers and life and death. Whatever your growing up moment is, um, whether you are the one left behind or the one doing the leaving, share the sights, the sounds, smells, tastes, and touches associated with that moment. Look at your rough draft and highlight where you see any boring or non-specific language, and then replace it with imagery so that you're showing the reader what's happening versus telling them. I know I've repeated this statement so much: show, don't tell, but that's all writing really is. You can tell someone a story and it's hard for them to feel like they're not there, but if you show them the moments, the people, they feel more invested. If you're reading through your vignette and you don't feel any emotion or suspense come up, then your vignette likely doesn't have enough imagery. So let's work on revising today. The reader should basically feel like they're present in the moment with you as you describe it. Holler at me if you have any questions today, and remember to look at your feedback, which you received last night.